Hi everyone. I wanted to put out a brief kind of video response to discussion board number 2. As of this last Saturday here a couple of days ago on the 7th, everyone had their discussion board 2 graded and back to them with individual comments. So please make sure you read those individual comments because I put quite a bit into those, but I also wanted to just put out some general thoughts and feedback. So this was a really complex question. The two people experiencing the same traumatic event, what role does perception ultimately play in trauma? The responses that you all had were pretty vast, pretty variable. So I want to go through kind of a few general ideas and a few things, respond to a couple of things. But before I do that, just really quickly, so I don't forget to say this, I wanted to note that there were quite a few of you who only made one post and not at least two posts. So you got some significant points off for that. I'm not sure if that was just forgetting to make your second post or a peer post. But please make sure that you guys are sticking with it. I know it's a tough part of the semester, but please make sure you're sticking with it and making at least two posts on every discussion board and then being thoughtful and deep and additive to the discussion and all of that. I'm still looking for all those things. Many of you have made some really great improvements in your post. You're clearly putting in more thought, more effort. You're kind of catching on to things. It's really fantastic to see that too. So just some general notes there. In terms of trauma in general, and guys, this is something that I have been studying really for the last 10 years or so and working a lot with teenagers, kids, and adults who have significant trauma in their lives and it's causing disruption to them. So this is something that's very near and dear to me. So a lot of people commented on and wrote about kind of internal characteristics that someone that may make them more susceptible to perceiving something as traumatic or not. A lot of you refer to this as resiliency, which is a word that's used a lot out there, and that's true. There are internal characteristics that can make someone more susceptible to experiencing something as traumatic or not. So one of the most basic one of those that some of you mentioned was if someone has similar trauma in their lives that has happened in the past, then a repeated circumstance could trigger some sort of traumatic reaction or some sort of even PTSD type of situation down the road. That's possible. It doesn't even have to be related trauma. It could be if someone is suffering from depression or has anxiety in general or things. Those things can make someone more susceptible to experiencing traumatic effects. These are what we call internal vulnerabilities, and a lot of you kind of talked about those. Much fewer of you talked about external vulnerabilities or external characteristics of the traumatic event itself that might have an impact on someone, and this is really, really important. So research has shown that the number one predictor as to whether someone will experience a singular traumatic event as traumatic or not is their physical proximity to the trauma. So for instance, and this is an extreme example, but there's a big difference between being on the playground while a shooting is happening outside on the playground versus being inside the school or being at home that day. That physical proximity is a huge predictor. Emotional proximity is also a big predictor too. So in that same circumstance, if I have a close friend that dies, some of you talked about death as a consequence. If I have a close friend that dies in that playground incident, then I am at much closer emotional proximity to the event than someone who didn't know anyone who got hurt or died or anything like that. So makes me a lot more vulnerable to experiencing traumatic effect. That's actually a real study that was done if you're interested in it. It was by Pynoos et al. That's Pynoos. I think it was 1986. He has a landmark study in studying physical proximity to a traumatic event. So there's internal and external stuff that goes on when we experience a singular traumatic event. One of you even identified that only about 30% of people who experience a singular traumatic event will go on to develop full-blown PTSD. Now that's almost a third, so yes, that's kind of a lot, but when you think about it, even with something like a shooting, only about 30% of people will go on to develop full-blown PTSD. It's expected that people will experience traumatic effects for a couple of weeks per se, but then those things should subside, generally speaking. So sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a second. So traumatic stress, just so you all know, is actually defined by normal responses to abnormal circumstances. Normal responses to abnormal circumstances. So if you are involved in a shooting or a traumatic tornado or a devastating flood or anything like that, then you're going to have some maybe difficulty sleeping, some hypervigilance, some avoidance of things. Those things are all normal. It's how long and how long they last for, and how intense they are over the weeks and the months. So, okay, so those are just some general thoughts about that. Some of you talked about the importance of getting people hooked up with support and how important support is in trauma in general, which you were spot on, especially with a singular traumatic event. Getting people hooked up with their sources of support is really important. With chronic trauma or ongoing trauma, support is also really important. Research has shown, and I have seen it in my work, that if a person even has one person that genuinely is there for them and genuinely loves them and cares for them, no matter where that person goes. So if it's a child in foster care kind of jumping around homes, but they have one person, maybe a grandmother or maybe somebody else who's there for them and has their back, it's a big deal. And prognosis is a lot better in terms of long-term outcome. Another big thing that came up in your responses, which was interesting, was how do I want to frame this? Does someone experiencing trauma kind of repeatedly, does that make them more resilient, or does that make them more susceptible to trauma? So some of you talked about how if someone experiences like repeated trauma, well, that makes them more resilient and better adjusted, as opposed to someone who hasn't experienced anything, and they'll be able to cope better, or they won't be able to cope as well because they haven't experienced adversity, so they will struggle more. So there's no really kind of all or nothing, black or white way to think about this. Trauma is really complex. You cannot say that this one group of people will fare better than this other group, or these people, because of these experiences, will fare better. It's just not how it works. It's totally possible that someone who has been through notable trauma in their lives, who goes through adversity later in their lives, they are better adjusted. They can cope with and manage, maybe adverse experiences better. But it's certainly the case where that is not the case whatsoever. Okay? So it is totally, totally possible, and happens every day, where someone experiences adverse experiences, and because of their previous trauma, they really struggle with that. So, for instance, think of someone, a 7 or 8 year old kid who's growing up where there's a lot of domestic violence in the home. So most every night let's say he is experiencing a lot of screaming and yelling and fighting and hearing mom and dad get hit and throwing things and things like that. Really kind of intense situation, not getting sleep, going to school, struggling at school, so on and so forth. It's certainly the case where this may not make him more resilient to stress later in life. It may in some regards, but it totally may not. It's totally possible that maybe even 5 years later, when he is in a benign situation with his friends, but people start kind of yelling and joking around and pushing around, that he's kind of triggered and goes back to that place and gets aggressive. That's totally possible. So again, these are just examples, but when you think about trauma, you really can't put any individual person into a box, and you've got to be really careful about painting broad strokes with, well, this will happen or that will happen, or if this person believes in God, then that will happen this way and this will happen that way. It's just not how it works. Um, every individual person is infinitely complex and will respond to adverse circumstances, whether they're 2 years old or 22 years old or 82 years old, in different ways. And it may be at serious detriment to them, or it may give them resiliency to cope with stuff further in their life. On a side note too, just because a child cannot remember their trauma does not mean that it is not affecting them. So this is a misnomer a lot in the trauma field, where we think sometimes that, well, if the trauma happened when she was 2 or 3 or 4 and she can't remember it or recall it or verbalize it, that it doesn't affect that. But that's just not true. Our bodies and our brains are amazing at protecting us. Absolutely amazing. So for instance, if there's a 3-year-old or 4-year-old that's being sexually abused, that 3 or 4-year-old unconsciously may start urinating him or herself when they're at school, when they're scared. They may start acting out in a sexualized type of way without really knowing at all what they're doing. And these are ways that our body and our brain are trying to communicate to the outside world that there's something wrong. So please keep that in mind, that the brain and the body are extraordinarily powerful when it comes to trauma, and it does do things that we do not necessarily agree to do, and that they are our protectors. So just because someone can't remember something at 2, 3, or 4, or 5, or whatever, does not mean that it doesn't affect them. Let's see. I think that's everything, everybody. I hope you're all doing well. Please email me any thoughts or questions, and look forward to talking with you more.